Read it again, Professor Yom said, not looking up from his notes. Slower, perhaps that is all you can manage. Lin Fam's hand trembled around the edge of her textbook. 30 students in the lecture hall held their pens still, the way people hold their breath near something about to break. Lin tried the sentence a third time, her voice thinning with every syllable, and near the back row, Amara Okafor felt the old familiar heat rise under her collar, the one she had spent years training herself to sit on and swallow. Not this time, a voice inside her said, quiet and certain. Not while I am still in this room. Perhaps our friend from Nigeria can explain the mistake, Yom said, and a ripple of laughter moved through the hall, quiet and complicit. If she has learned that much. Amara did not laugh. She closed the worn leather notebook on her desk, gathered herself for exactly one breath, and rose without waiting to be asked twice. Every head in the lecture hall turned toward her at once. She had spent 4 years being complimented for merely existing in this language, as though fluency in a country not her own were a party trick, and not a debt paid in early mornings, lost sleep, and money she did not have. She was finished accepting the compliment. "Professor," she said, in Korean too clean to interrupt, "may I answer instead?" She did not wait for permission. In 9 unhurried seconds she corrected Lin's sentence, gently, without a trace of mockery, and in the same breath corrected the professor's own, naming the exact honorific form printed on his slide that had fallen out of spoken use 2 decades earlier, and the page of the textbook where a newer form appeared. Her Korean was calm and rounded, the vowels shaped the patient way a grandmother shapes them, teaching rather than performing, correcting rather than winning. For 3 full seconds the great lecture hall made no sound at all. Then, from the back row, a single chair began, quietly and unmistakably, to scrape against the floor. Every head turned again, this time toward the sound. A young man in a plain dark suit was rising to his feet. The son no one in that hall had ever heard speak in a class he was not required to attend. The son everyone assumed sat quietly in the back row to protect his father's oldest friend. Kang Jun-ho was not supposed to be in that room at all, and he was certainly not supposed to stand for a stranger against a man who had signed his father's tenure papers before Jun-ho was born. He stood anyway, and no one in the room, least of all Amara, understood yet what it would cost him. Kang Jun-ho did not raise his voice. "Professor," he said, his tone level enough to sound almost polite, "the citation on your slide is outdated. She is right. Nothing more. No accusation, no drama. Only a fact laid on the table like a document that could not be argued with." Professor Yom's jaw tightened, color rising along his throat, and for a long moment the only sound in the amphitheater was the hum of the projector. He dismissed the class 12 minutes early, his voice flat, already rewriting the morning into something smaller than it had been. Students filed out in careful silence, phones lowered, eyes darting between the young woman still standing at her desk and the man who had stood for her without being asked. Amara Okafor sat back down slowly, her pulse loud in her ears. She had come to Honoru University on a scholarship that required, among other things, a clean record and Professor Yom's signature at the end of the semester. She had just spent both to correct a sentence that was not even about her. She gathered her notebook, its leather cover soft with 4 years of handling, and did not look at anyone as she walked out. In the hallway, Lin Fam caught up to her near the stairwell, eyes red-rimmed but steady now. "You did not have to do that," she said quietly, in careful English. "I know," Amara answered, and left it there, because there was nothing to add that would not sound like she was asking for gratitude she did not want. Other classmates passed them without stopping, the same students who had sat through the entire humiliation without lifting a hand, now suddenly absorbed in their phones, in the floor, in anything that was not 2 international students standing too close to a fresh wound. Amara understood it. She had done the same thing once, in her first month in Seoul, looked away from someone else's trouble because she could not afford to become visible. She had 4 part-time jobs stitched into a single exhausting week, a mother in Enugu who called every Sunday and pretended the market was doing better than it was, and a scholarship renewal meeting in 11 days that depended on exactly the kind of unremarkable, unnoticed record she had just spent in 9 seconds. She squeezed Lin's shoulder once, told her to eat something, and walked toward her next shift, already calculating what the morning might cost her. Professor Yom found her outside the language lab 2 days later, his voice pleasant in a way that made the hair on her arms rise. "You embarrassed me in front of my own students," he said, still smiling, still perfectly correct. I am simply noting for the record that participation and classroom conduct are also part of my evaluation. He did not raise his voice, did not use a single word that could be repeated to anyone as proof of anything. That was the danger of him, Amara understood, watching his composed face. He had built an entire career on being reasonable in rooms where he held all the power. She answered him in the same even register he had used on her, thanked him for the clarification, and said nothing else, because there was nothing she could say that would not be used against her later. He left first. She stood alone in the corridor for a full minute afterward, replaying the exchange for anything she might have said differently, before checking the time and running the 6 blocks to her tutoring job, already 15 minutes behind and unable, for the first time in years, to make herself care about being late. That night, walking home along the neon-lit side streets near her one-room apartment, she felt the particular exhaustion of a day that had cost more than it paid. Food stalls steamed under string lights, delivery scooters cut past puddles catching the glow of convenience store signs, and somewhere above her a subway train rattled over its bridge, ordinary and indifferent to the morning she had survived. Her phone buzzed as she reached her door. An email sent from the office of the dean, subject line stripped of any warmth. Request to discuss a classroom matter, tomorrow, 9 o'clock. No explanation of whether she was being commended or dismissed. She read it twice, then a third time, standing in the hallway with her key still in the lock, trying to decide whether the man who had stood up for her that morning had helped her or ended her scholarship for her. She thought of her father's voice, the one she still carried, telling her once that a tongue does not apologize for the words it has learned. She let herself into the apartment, set an alarm for 6, and did not sleep much at all. She arrived at the office of the dean 11 minutes early, having come straight from a graveyard translation shift, a thermos of instant coffee doing most of the work her sleep should have done. The waiting room smelled of old paper and polished wood, portraits of past deans lining the walls in identical dark frames, and Amara sat with her notebook in her lap, rehearsing, in Korean, 3 different versions of an explanation she should not have needed to give. She had done nothing wrong. She reminded herself of that fact the way she reminded herself of vocabulary lists, repeating it until it held its shape. A secretary finally called her name, and she rose, straightened the blazer she had chosen specifically because it looked like someone who could not be easily frightened, and walked in with her spine set. Whatever this meeting decided, she intended to leave it exactly as she had entered it, unshaken, unapologetic, a version of herself her father would have recognized. The door closed behind her with a soft final click, and for a moment, the room beyond it held only silence and the low hum of a building already fully awake. Waiting outside the inner office, her mind slid back, unbidden, to her first month in Seoul, to a registrar's line she had stood in for 2 hours only to be told, without apology, that her documents were in the wrong order and she would have to return another day. She remembered the commuters on the subway platform who stepped around her when her suitcase wheel jammed in a gap, the clerk who sighed at her accent and slowed his speech as though she were a child rather than a foreigner. She remembered, too, the one exception, a stranger in a dark coat who had wordlessly lifted the far end of her suitcase over the gap without breaking his stride, gone before she could properly thank him, his face a blur she had never been able to place. She had told herself afterward that Seoul was full of people who looked away and a very few who did not, and that she would try, whenever she could afford it, to be one of the few. She had no way of knowing yet that the stranger from the platform and the man who had stood up for her 2 days ago might be the same person. Inside, it was not the dean waiting for her but his son. Kang Jun-ho stood when she entered, gestured to a chair with the same economy of motion he had used to stand in that lecture hall, and told her plainly that she was not in trouble, that he had asked to speak with her before his father did. He explained in careful, unembellished sentences that he had been sitting in on Professor Yom's classes for most of the semester at his father's request, following 2 earlier complaints from international students that had gone nowhere the year before. Lin's name was one of 3 he mentioned. Amara listened without softening her posture, unwilling yet to decide whether this was help or simply damage control dressed politely. "Why does the dean's office care now?" she asked, when it did not care before. He did not flinch from the question. "Because the earlier complaints were quiet," he said. "Yours was not." It was, she realized, the most honest answer anyone in that building had given her all week, and it unsettled her more than a lie would have. "Why do you care?" she asked again, more directly this time. because vague honesty was not the same as an answer. Junho considered the question the way he seemed to consider everything, unhurried, unwilling to say more than he meant. "Because I have spent 3 years watching my father protect a man who does not deserve protecting," he said finally, "and I am tired of being the son who watches." He slid a plain card across the desk, only a name and an internal extension number, and asked, without pressure, whether she would be willing to speak formally if the review moved forward, for herself and for Lin. He made clear it would cost her something either way, that there was no version of this where standing up remained free. Amara turned the card over in her fingers, thought of her scholarship renewal in 9 days now, of her mother's voice on the phone every Sunday, of the version of herself who had risen in that lecture hall without calculating the cost first. She did not answer him that morning. She put the card in her notebook, between 2 pages of vocabulary, and told him she would think about it. She thought about the card for 4 days before she called Lin instead of the extension number written on it. If she was going to risk anything, she decided, it would not be alone, and it would not be for a stranger's convenience. It would be because Lin deserved to have her name attached to her own defense. She ran the numbers the way she ran every decision that mattered, plainly, without romance. She could lose the recommendation letter she needed for the fellowship application in the spring. She could lose hours she did not have, hours that were already promised to a tutoring job and a translation contract, and, on Sundays, to her mother's voice asking careful questions about money neither of them wanted to discuss directly. She could lose, if it went badly enough, the unremarkable good standing a foreign student needed, simply to remain in the country without complications. She weighed all of it against the memory of Lin's hand trembling around a textbook, and against her father's line, worn soft in her memory the way the leather notebook was worn soft in her hands, and she called Lin back within the hour to say she would help her write it properly. They spent 3 nights in a 24-hour study room on the edge of campus, the kind with vending machine coffee and fluorescent light that made everyone look slightly unwell, drafting and redrafting a single page until it said exactly what it needed to say, and nothing that could be dismissed as emotional. Amara took Lin's fear, still raw and half-formed in translation, and shaped it into formal Korean sentence by sentence, reading each one aloud until Lin nodded that it sounded true to what had actually happened. Their tea went cold twice. Somewhere past midnight on the second night, Lin admitted, quietly, that Professor Yom had done something similar to her the year before, with a different student, and that she had said nothing then because no one had ever offered to sit beside her while she said it. Amara did not answer that with sympathy, which she sensed Lin did not want, but with a fresh page and a pen, and they kept writing. By the 3rd night the statement was finished, precise and unembellished, 4 paragraphs that read less like a complaint and more like a record, the kind Amara's father had once told her was the only kind of writing that could not be argued away. Junho heard about the finished statement before he heard from Amara herself, a quiet note from the office that 2 students, not one, would be submitting testimony that week. He sat with her academic file open on his desk longer than the review required, noting things that had nothing to do with the complaint, her course load stacked improbably high around part-time work hours, a thesis proposal on regional dialect erosion that no one in the department had yet bothered to properly supervise, a transcript with exactly the kind of quiet excellence that never drew attention because it never asked for any. He closed the file, aware he was doing something closer to curiosity than due diligence, and told himself that ensuring the review was procedurally sound for both students was simply his job. It did not entirely convince him. He thought of the 9 seconds in the lecture hall, of how she had corrected a professor without a trace of triumph in her voice, only precision, and he understood, in the private, inconvenient way people understand things they are not ready to say aloud, that he wanted to know what her days actually looked like, not only the parts of them that ended up in a file. He found the cafe by asking, plainly, at the front desk of the language center where she had once listed a work number, and told himself the visit was simply to update her on the review's timeline, information he could easily have sent by email. She was behind the counter when he walked in, sleeves pushed up, hair tied back, calling out an order in rapid, easy Korean to the barista beside her, entirely unlike the composed witness he had interviewed days before. She saw him before he reached the counter and did not smile exactly, but something in her shoulders eased. He ordered in deliberately careful, slightly overcorrected Korean, a drink he did not particularly want, and she raised an eyebrow at the formality of his sentence structure, the first crack he had allowed anyone at that university to see in months. "You sound like you are asking a professor for an extension," she said, and he almost laughed, an unfamiliar sound in his own throat. He told her the hearing date had not been set yet. She told him she already knew. Neither of them mentioned that the timeline was not, strictly speaking, the reason either of them was still standing at that counter. They ended up sitting at the counter after her shift, the cafe emptied of customers, and he told her more than he had planned to. His mother had been a translator, fluent in 4 languages, the reason there were still dictionaries stacked in odd corners of the Kang house that no one had the heart to move. She had died when he was 17, and his father, unable to grieve in any way that looked like grieving, had buried himself deeper into the university instead, leaving Junho to more or less raise his much younger sister with the help of a housekeeper and his own stubborn sense of duty. He did not say this to make her feel sorry for him, and she did not treat it that way. She recognized the shape of it too well, a parent's absence reorganizing a child's entire life without ever being named directly as loss. She told him, in exchange, about her father, a professor of classical languages in Enugu, who used to say that learning a new language was like being handed a second childhood, clumsy and slow and worth it. Neither of them said anything for a moment after that, the silence comfortable in a way. Silence between near strangers rarely was. He mentioned the fellowship carefully, almost as an afterthought, a research position under a different advisor, better funded and further from Professor Yom's reach, and said he would be glad to submit her name if she wanted it. Amara set her cup down with more precision than the gesture required. "No," she said, and then, seeing his expression, softened only the delivery and not the answer. "Thank you, but no." She explained that her scholarship was tied to the exchange agreement under Yom's program, that switching now, in the middle of a formal complaint against him, would read to everyone watching exactly the way she could not afford it to read, as though she had engineered the entire confrontation to trade up. She had spent 4 years building a record no one could question. She was not going to hand anyone a reason to question it now, not even a kind one. Junho did not push. He only nodded, filed the refusal away the way he filed most things, without letting it show on his face that he had half expected and half hoped that she would say yes. Trying, badly, to lighten the moment he had accidentally weighted down, Junho asked what she had meant earlier by the dish she had mentioned to the barista, something with a name he mangled so thoroughly that Amara laughed out loud for the first time since he had met her. A real laugh, surprised out of her. "Jollof," she corrected, slower, and he tried again, worse, with the exact careful over-articulation he used for difficult Korean grammar, as though precision alone could compensate for having no idea what he was doing. "You correct professors in perfect Korean," he said, mock-wounded, "and you will not help me with 4 syllables." "I am helping," she said. "You are simply bad at this." It was a small exchange, almost nothing, and yet it did something neither of them named directly, made the space between them feel less like an office and a witness, and more like 2 people who might, under different circumstances, have simply liked each other. She wrote the word down for him anyway, in the corner of a napkin, in careful block letters, and he folded it into his jacket pocket like it mattered more than a napkin should. Before he left, almost as an afterthought that did not sound like one, he mentioned his sister, 11 years old, preparing for an interview at an international school in 6 weeks, and asked, in careful professional terms, whether Amara might consider tutoring her in English, properly paid, entirely separate from anything to do with the university. Amara hesitated. She thought of the fellowship she had just refused on principle, and of her mother's last phone call, the one where her mother had tried, and failed, to keep the worry out of her voice about a doctor's bill she thought Amara did not know about. Principal did not pay medical bills in Enugu. She agreed, but set the terms herself, a fixed hourly rate, a fixed schedule, nothing that blurred into favor or gratitude. He accepted the terms without negotiating a single one of them, which she noted, and did not know yet whether to be reassured or unsettled by. Walking home that night, she found herself replaying the napkin, the mangled word, the laugh that had come out of her before she could stop it, and wondering, with real irritation at herself, why any of it still occupied so much space in her head. The Kang house was larger and colder than she expected, all clean lines and expensive quiet, and So-yeon met her at the door with the flat, assessing look of a child who has watched too many adults come and go. "You are the 4th tutor this year," she announced, before Amara had even taken off her shoes. The last one cried in the bathroom. Amara set down her bag, unbothered, and asked why. So-yeon shrugged, delighted to have provoked a real question instead of a scolding. "I asked her too many things she didn't know," she said. Amara sat across from her at the dining table, opened her notebook to a blank page and said, evenly, that she liked hard questions, that she had built an entire life out of answering ones no one expected her to answer. Something in So-yeon's posture shifted, curiosity edging out suspicion. 2 hours later, Junho came home to find them still at the table, So-yeon reading an English sentence aloud with real effort instead of theatrical boredom, Amara correcting her the same unhurried way she had corrected a professor, without a trace of impatience. He stood in the doorway a moment before either of them noticed him, unwilling to interrupt something that was clearly working. Over the following weeks, Amara built the lessons around stories rather than drills. An Igbo folktale about a tortoise who talked his way out of every trap he built for himself, paired against a Korean proverb So-yeon offered in return about a frog forgetting the pond it came from. They traded proverbs the way other people traded stickers, each one a small proof that the world made sense in more than one language at once. So-yeon began greeting her at the door instead of assessing her, began leaving vocabulary questions folded into notes for Amara to find on the table, began, without announcing it, trusting her. Junho watched more of these sessions than he admitted to attending, lingering in doorways with paperwork he was not really reading, struck each time by how naturally Amara created a room where a guarded child felt safe enough to be wrong out loud. It was, he thought, not so different from what she had done in that lecture hall, correcting without humiliating, teaching without performing superiority, and he found himself rearranging his own schedule, more often than strictly necessary, to be home during the hour she was. One evening she arrived straight from her cafe shift with a container of jollof rice she had not had time to eat, and rather than let it go cold in her bag through the whole lesson, she set it on the table and offered a spoonful to So-yeon, who declared it, after enormous suspicion, the best thing she had eaten all month. Junho, arriving home mid-declaration, was handed a spoon without being asked whether he wanted one, and ate under the combined supervision of both of them, visibly trying to arrange his face into something diplomatic. "It is spicier than it looks," Amara warned, half a second too late. He did not embarrass himself, quite, though his eyes watered enough that So-yeon laughed until she had to put her own spoon down. It became, without either adult deciding it on purpose, a small ritual, a container of something from her world set down on their table every few visits, a household rearranging itself in small, ordinary increments around a woman who had walked in as a paid tutor and was becoming, gradually, something the house had not had in years, warmth that did not have to be scheduled. On the evenings their schedules overlapped, Junho began walking her to the subway, and then, with a transparency that fooled neither of them, riding 2 stops past his own station because it was, he claimed, on his way. It was not on his way. She let the claim stand because the alternative was naming what was actually happening, and she was not ready to name it either. They talked less than she expected on those rides, comfortable in a silence that would have felt wrong with anyone else, watching the tunnel lights strobe past the windows, occasionally trading a sentence about her thesis, or his father's latest demand, or So-yeon's stubborn refusal to pronounce a particular vowel correctly. Once, exhausted past the point of guarding herself, she fell asleep for 4 stops with her head tipped toward the window, and woke to find he had shifted almost imperceptibly closer, not touching her, simply near enough that she would not tip further. Neither of them mentioned it. She filed it away instead, next to the napkin word and the mangled pronunciation, in the growing, uneasy category of things about him she had stopped being able to file under simple gratitude. It was So-yeon who finally said the thing neither adult would. Mid-lesson, apropos of nothing, she looked up from her workbook and asked, in the blunt, unfiltered way of an 11-year-old who has been paying far closer attention than anyone credited her for, whether Amara was her brother's girlfriend. The question landed in the room like a dropped plate. Amara opened her mouth to say something composed and failed to produce it. Junho, who had just walked in with grocery bags, stopped entirely in the doorway, uncharacteristically caught without a controlled answer ready. "I am your English tutor," Amara managed finally, which was true and also, they all seemed to sense, no longer the whole truth. So-yeon looked between the 2 frozen adults with the satisfied expression of a child who has confirmed a theory, said only, "Okay," and returned to her workbook as though she had not just detonated something. Junho set the grocery bags down with excessive care. Amara did not look at him for the rest of the lesson, aware of exactly how much unnamed ground had just been named by an 11-year-old, and equally aware that neither of them had actually denied it. Later that same week, after Soyeon had gone to bed, Junho found her still on the balcony, looking out at the glass towers stitched together with light, and instead of retreating into the safe subject they had avoided all evening, he asked her, plainly, what her father had actually been like. She told him about the university office in Enugu stacked floor to ceiling with dictionaries and languages he never fully mastered but loved regardless. About the year he grew sicker and kept teaching anyway because he said a man should die doing the thing that made him useful. About the notebook he had given her on the day the doctors used a word she still could not repeat without her throat tightening. He listened without offering comfort too quickly, which she appreciated more than she could have explained, and told her, in exchange, about his mother's handwriting, still visible in the margins of books no one in the house had the heart to reshelve, about learning grief mostly by watching his father refuse to have any. Neither of their losses matched the other's exactly, but the shape of growing up around an absence did, and for a while neither of them needed to say anything else. He told her, that night, more than he had told most people at the university in years, about the expectations sitting on him since childhood to eventually chair the same department his father chaired, about the calculated silences he had kept for 3 years while Yom's pattern repeated itself with different vulnerable students, silences he had told himself were strategy and now recognized, in front of her, as something closer to cowardice dressed up as patience. You did not hesitate, he said. I have been hesitating for 3 years. She did not offer him easy forgiveness for that, which he seemed almost relieved by, only pointed out that hesitating and finally standing were not opposites, that most people simply hesitated forever and called it wisdom. He had not, in the end, hesitated forever. That distinction, small as it sounded, seemed to settle something in him he had been carrying since the lecture hall. Below them, the city kept moving, delivery scooters and late buses, and the endless soft roar of a place that did not pause for anyone's private reckoning. And for once neither of them minded being one small, quiet exception to all of it. She found out almost by accident, weeks later, that a scholarship housing document she had been anxiously chasing through an unresponsive office for a month had been quietly resolved, the delay traced to an administrative error and corrected within a single afternoon after someone in the dean's office made a call. She did not need to ask who. She confronted him about it plainly, not with gratitude, but with something closer to alarm, told him she had not asked for that kind of help and did not want to become a person who needed it, that every act of protection she did not ask for felt like a debt she had not agreed to owe. He listened, did not apologize exactly, but told her honestly that he had made the call before thinking it through as anything other than fixing an obvious injustice, and that he would try, going forward, to ask first. It was not a complete resolution. She still felt the discomfort of it sitting in her chest days later, the fear of becoming someone rescued rather than someone standing on her own record, but she believed, watching his face, that he had heard her, and for now that had to be enough. It rained hard the following Thursday, the kind of sudden soul downpour that turned the walk from the subway into a small emergency, and he was waiting at the exit with a single umbrella when she came up the stairs, soaked already at the shoulders from an earlier errand. He held it over her without comment, angled so that most of the rain fell on his own side, a fact she noticed and did not mention. They walked slowly, closer than the umbrella strictly required, past shuttered shops and neon signs blurred soft by water, and somewhere near her building he stopped mid-sentence, something almost said and then visibly reconsidered, his jaw working once before he simply said goodnight instead. She stood at her door afterward longer than necessary, replaying the stopped sentence, certain it had been about to become something neither of them had said out loud yet, certain, too, that she was no longer entirely sure she wanted him to keep not saying it. She let herself inside eventually, the rain still coming down steady behind her, and did not sleep for a long time, listening to it against the window and thinking about a sentence with no ending. The invitation came formally, on university letterhead, rather than through Junho, a request from Dean Kang Tae-min that Amara join a small dinner to properly thank the tutor who had, in his words, done such good work with his daughter. She understood immediately that thanks was only part of it. Junho, when she mentioned it, went uncharacteristically quiet, told her only that his father did things formally when he wanted to look closely at someone without appearing to, and that she should expect questions dressed as pleasantries. She chose her clothes carefully that evening, not to impress but to armor, a dark blazer, her father's old wristwatch, the version of herself that had once stood up in a lecture hall without flinching. The Kang dining room was even colder than the rest of the house. Long table, formal place settings, portraits of ancestors watching from heavy frames. Dean Kang rose when she entered, correct and courteous in a way that told her nothing yet about what he actually intended, and gestured her to a seat directly across from him, close enough that there would be nowhere comfortable to look except at each other for the length of the meal. He asked about her family first, her studies second, her visa status third, each question phrased with impeccable courtesy and landing, nonetheless, exactly where she expected it to land. He wanted to know her plans after graduation, whether she intended to remain in Korea, whether she understood, as he put it, how quickly a young woman's reputation could attach itself to a powerful family's name in ways neither party controlled. Amara set down her chopsticks and answered him without heat. She told him her plans were her own and did not depend on his son, that she had built her record here alone before Junho had ever learned her name, and that if he was asking whether she intended to use his family for anything, the answer was no, she had never once needed to. She told him, further, that she found the question faintly insulting, and said so plainly, watching his face for the flicker of surprise she caught, and that he tried, not entirely successfully, to hide. It was not the answer of someone hoping to be liked. It was, she suspected, exactly the answer he had actually come to that dinner to test for. Dinner moved, eventually, to the subject neither of them had named yet directly. Professor Yom, the dean admitted, had written the recommendation that secured his own first faculty position 30 years earlier, had stood beside him at his wife's funeral when half the department had sent flowers instead of showing up, had, in every practical sense, made the life Dean Kang now lived possible. He did not defend Yom's conduct in the classroom, said plainly that he did not doubt her account of it, but asked, delicately, whether the formal complaint truly needed to proceed to a full hearing, whether some quieter resolution might allow an old man to retire with the dignity 3 decades of service had earned him. Amara understood, listening, that this was the actual purpose of the dinner, dressed in courtesy and old grief. She told him she would not ask Lin to withdraw her statement, that dignity earned through decades of service did not erase what had happened in that lecture hall, and that she had not stood up that day to be quietly negotiated back down now. The dean did not argue further. He only nodded, slowly, the nod of a man recalculating something he had assumed was simple. She left before dessert, thanked the dean for the meal with perfect, unreadable courtesy, and was 3 steps past the front gate when she heard Junho behind her, having excused himself from his own father's table to catch up with her on the dark street. He did not apologize for his father, which she respected, but he did not defend him either, and for a moment he simply stood there, hands in his pockets, looking like a man caught exactly between 2 people he did not want to disappoint. "He is not wrong that this will cost something," he said finally. "He is wrong about what it is worth." She studied his face in the streetlight, trying to read which side of that sentence he actually believed when it counted, when a hearing room and not a dinner table forced the choice into the open. She did not ask him directly. She was not certain yet that she wanted to hear the answer before he had actually been tested by it. She said goodnight instead, walked the rest of the way to the subway alone, and left him standing at his father's gate, turning the whole conversation over without her. The video surfaced 9 days later, a shaky phone clip filmed from 3 rows back that someone had finally uploaded to the university's anonymous campus board. 22 seconds of Amara rising to correct Professor Yom, followed by 11 seconds of Junho standing in the silence that came after. By morning, it had spread past the board entirely, reposted with captions in Korean and English, the exact 9-second correction replayed and dissected by students who had not even been in the room. Amara found out about it from 3 separate group chats before she had finished her coffee, her own voice suddenly public property, her face recognizable now to strangers on the subway who had only ever half-noticed international students before. She watched the clip once, critically, the way she might review her own thesis draft, and felt strangely detached from the version of herself on the screen, calm and certain in a way she did not currently feel at all. Lin texted her almost immediately, frightened rather than pleased, asking whether this made things better or worse for the hearing. Amara did not have an honest answer yet. She only knew that whatever quiet, private process they had been building toward no longer existed. Within 2 days, a campus gossip account had built an entire narrative around the clip. Screenshots of Amara arriving at and leaving the Kang residence stitched together with breathless captions suggesting she had engineered the classroom confrontation to attract the dean's son's attention, that the tutoring arrangement was cover, that international students were, as one particularly ugly comment put it, always looking for an angle into a Korean family's money. Amara read exactly one thread of it before forcing herself to close the app, her hands unsteady in a way 9 seconds in a lecture hall had never made them. It was not the cruelty alone that frightened her, though the cruelty was real. It was the shape of it, a story that erased 4 years of unglamorous work and turned it into an accusation of scheming, a story that would follow her into scholarship committee meetings and visa renewals long after the actual facts stopped mattering to anyone scrolling past it. She thought of her mother possibly seeing some translated version of this, and felt something in her chest tighten that no correct Korean sentence had ever been able to fix. Professor Yom moved quickly once the video gave him an opening he had not had before. He filed a formal grievance against Junho, not for the classroom incident directly, but for what he termed months of unauthorized observation and interference in his teaching, framing his own decades of conduct as a scapegoat for a dean's son abusing his family's position to settle a personal grudge. It was, Amara had to admit, a clever reversal, one that did not need to disprove anything she or Lin had said, only needed to make Junho's involvement look improper enough to poison the whole review. The grievance threatened his teaching fellowship, the recommendation he needed for his own doctoral committee, and, more quietly, his father's confidence in his judgment at a moment when the department was already fracturing into sides. Junho told her about it plainly, without asking for sympathy, but she saw, for the first time since the lecture hall, something like fear behind his composure, the recognition that the cost he had accepted in the abstract, standing up that morning, had finally arrived with an exact price attached, and that price was no longer hypothetical. Her own scholarship committee scheduled an unscheduled review within the week, citing, in bureaucratic language, recent public attention as grounds for reassessing her standing, and Amara understood immediately that this was not concern for her well-being, but a search for a reason to distance the program from a controversy. She stopped answering Junho's messages as quickly as before, not from anger but from a cold, practical instinct to control what little she still could. When he came by the cafe, she asked him, quietly and without apology, to stop, told him that every photo of the two of them together fed the exact story that could end her scholarship and her ability to stay in the country at all, that she needed, for now, to be seen as a student defending a fact and nothing else. He argued, briefly, that hiding would only make the rumor look truer. She told him she was not asking his opinion, she was asking for space, and after a long moment he agreed, jaw tight, and left without the goodbye he usually offered. The days that followed were quieter than any since the lecture hall, an emptiness that felt less like peace than like held breath. So-yeon texted her twice asking why lessons had moved to a different time with a different arrangement, careful now, routed through an assistant rather than through her brother directly, and Amara answered with something vague about scheduling, unwilling to explain to an 11-year-old what she could barely explain to herself. The official notice arrived on a Thursday, the ethics hearing set for the following week, a formal room, a formal panel, a date that suddenly made the entire abstract mess concrete and unavoidable. She read the notice twice at her kitchen table, alone, the leather notebook closed beside her rather than open, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost like relief, that whatever this hearing decided, she and Junho had reached the exact point the dean had warned her about at dinner, the point where a private choice had to become a public one, made in a room neither of them could soften with an umbrella or a container of rice. She called her mother that Sunday earlier than usual, unable to wait for the scheduled hour, and found herself, for the first time in months, admitting how frightened she actually was, of the hearing, of the scholarship review, of a version of this story that ended with her sent home before she had finished anything she came here to finish. Her mother listened the way she always had, without interrupting, the market noise faint behind her voice, and when Amara finally ran out of words, her mother said only that her father used to tell his students the same thing every difficult semester, that a tongue does not apologize for the words it has learned, and that this had never only been about language, it had always been about not shrinking to make other people comfortable. "You did not become smaller in that lecture hall," her mother said. "Do not become smaller now because it costs more than you expected. Amara sat with the phone pressed to her ear long after the call ended, the familiar ache of missing home sitting alongside something steadier, a decision quietly reforming itself under her ribs. Across the city, Junho spent that same night at his mother's old desk, going through a box of her notebooks he had not opened since her funeral, translation notes in 3 languages, small marginal jokes to herself in his father's family dialect. A woman who had clearly loved the exact kind of precise, unglamorous work Amara loved. He thought about the version of himself his father wanted him to become, careful, patient, loyal to institutions above people, and the version of himself standing in a lecture hall 9 days ago and understood, turning his mother's handwriting over in his hands, which version he actually wanted to keep being. He decided that night to testify fully at the hearing regardless of the grievance against him, regardless of what it cost his fellowship or his father's confidence, and to do it as himself, not as Amara's defender, because he did not want his choice tangled into a rumor that reduced her agency to his. He wrote nothing down. He simply closed the box, set his mother's notebooks back exactly where they belonged, and went to bed for the first time in a week without rehearsing an argument in his head. Lin came to Amara's apartment the night before the hearing, unannounced, carrying nothing but the folded copy of the statement they had written together weeks earlier, its edges soft now from handling. She told Amara she had spent the last 2 days deciding not to let fear write her testimony for her, that watching Amara stand up in that lecture hall had shown her something she had not believed about herself before, that being afraid and still speaking were not opposites. She was not there, she said carefully, to thank Amara again. She had done that already. She was there to tell her she did not have to carry tomorrow alone either. It was, Amara realized, the exact reversal of where they had started. Lin trembling behind a textbook while Amara rose to speak for her, and now Lin standing steady at her door reminding Amara that support was supposed to run in both directions. They sat together for an hour, not rehearsing anything, simply keeping each other company against the particular loneliness of the night before something irreversible. And when Lin finally left, Amara felt, for the first time in days, that she would not be walking into that room entirely unaccompanied. The morning of the hearing, Amara dressed the way she had dressed for the dean's office weeks earlier, the same blazer, the same deliberate posture, though the reasons underneath it had shifted somewhere in between. She was not walking into that room to defend a romance she had not yet named, and not only to defend herself, but because staying silent now, after everything, would have quietly undone the exact thing she had stood up for in that lecture hall in the first place. Before leaving her apartment, she opened her phone and typed a message to Junho, brief, unembellished, the kind of sentence her father would have approved of for saying exactly what it needed to say and nothing more. "I will be there today," she wrote, and left it at that. No explanation of what had changed since she asked him to stay away, no promise about what came after. She put the leather notebook in her bag, the one with his cards still tucked between 2 pages of vocabulary, and walked out into a gray Seoul morning that gave no indication, one way or another, of what the day would decide. The hearing room held none of the drama of the lecture hall, only a long table, a panel of 5 faculty members, and Dean Kang seated uncomfortably at the head, presiding over a case that had become, by now, impossible to separate from his own family. Lin spoke first, and spoke clearly, her voice steady in a way it had not been in months, naming exactly what had happened without softening it for anyone's comfort. 2 other former students, encouraged by the public attention neither of them had wanted, submitted written statements describing near-identical treatment from years before that had never been formally reported. Junho testified next, factually refusing every opportunity the panel offered him to frame his actions as protecting Amara rather than simply doing what any observer with evidence should have done, and did not once mention the grievance against himself as though it deserved equal weight in the room. When Amara was finally asked to speak, she did not raise her voice or reach for emotion. She laid out the linguistic evidence plainly, the outdated citation, the correct page, the exact facts that had made her correction accurate rather than defiant, and let the room draw its own conclusions from something that could not be argued away. Confronted with a pattern rather than a single incident, Professor Yom was offered early retirement rather than public dismissal, a resolution that let him leave with the outward dignity 30 years of service had earned him, and that also, unmistakably, ended his ability to stand in front of another vulnerable student. He did not apologize in the hearing room, only grew smaller in his chair as each new statement was read, a man finally out of reasonable-sounding sentences. Dean Kang, who had spent the entire hearing in visible discomfort, asked afterward to speak with Amara alone, and told her, without the careful courtesy of the dinner table, that he had been wrong to weigh an old debt against a plain fact, that watching his son testify without excusing himself had shown him something about the kind of man he had actually raised. He personally ensured in the following days that her scholarship review closed with her standing fully intact and that any residual note about public attention was struck from her file entirely. It was not, she understood, an apology exactly, but it was, from a man like him, the closest thing to one that acted rather than merely spoke. Weeks later, on the final class day of the semester, Amara stood at the front of the same lecture hall where it had all begun, invited this time by the department's new visiting instructor to guest address the room about regional dialect erosion, the exact thesis subject no one had previously bothered to properly supervise. She set her old leather notebook on the podium out of habit rather than need, opened it briefly to the first page before she began speaking, and let her eyes rest a moment on her father's handwriting, faded now but still legible. A tongue does not apologize for the words it has learned. She looked up toward the back row out of old instinct, half expecting the empty seat that had been there the first time, and found Jun-ho instead, sitting openly this time, not observing on his father's behalf, not hiding behind a file or a card slid across a desk, simply there, the same seat, an entirely different posture. She held his gaze for exactly 1 beat longer than the moment required, the way she had once watched him hold a reaction shot in her memory, and then began to speak, steady, unhurried, precisely herself. That evening, the three of them ended up around the same dining table where Se-yeon had once ambushed them both with a single blunt question, a pot of something that was neither fully Korean nor fully Nigerian simmering between them, Se-yeon narrating her own cooking contributions with enormous pride. Jun-ho waited until Se-yeon had wandered off to find a missing spoon before he reached across the table and set, deliberately, a small folded napkin beside Amara's plate, the same napkin, kept for months in his jacket pocket, her handwriting on it still faintly legible beneath his own clumsy attempt at the word. "A tongue does not apologize for the words it has learned," he said quietly, giving her father's line back to her in a voice that had clearly practiced saying it right. "I would like to keep learning yours, if you will let me." She did not answer with a speech, only reached over and covered his hand with hers, steady, sure, the same steadiness that had once risen in a lecture hall without calculating the cost first. Outside the window, Seoul kept its ordinary evening noise going, neon and traffic and distant trains, indifferent and constant, while inside, for once, nothing needed correcting at all.